For 10 years, a billionaire's daughter lived imprisoned in absolute darkness. Her father owned technology companies that could shape the future, wielding power enough to open any door in Manhattan. But he couldn't buy his daughter even a single moment of seeing light. The best doctors in America examined her. The top medical centers, closed expert panels. Millions of dollars were spent. Perfect scans. Thick reports. The conclusion remained the same. Congenital blindness. Cause unknown. No one found a flaw. No one found hope. Then, on an ordinary afternoon in Central Park, a 10-year-old poor black boy from Brownsville, with no medical knowledge, no degrees, no power, stopped in front of her. He sat down at her level, looked into the eyes that dozens of experts had examined under the most advanced equipment, and noticed a detail that every one of them had missed. In just a few short minutes, he removed something extremely tiny, almost invisible, that had been there for 10 years. And in that very moment, the billionaire's daughter said something no one had ever heard from her in her life. Why is everything brighter? But the instant that object lay on the tip of his finger, everything began to grow dark in a different way. Because it wasn't a rare disease, not a random medical oversight. Someone had placed it there, and when they traced it back to the person who did it, that truth completely shattered the sense of security of everyone in the room. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel right now and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, because what happens next will make you wonder, who are you really trusting when you hand your child over to someone else? Now let me take you back to where it all began. In the early hours at New York, Presbyterian Hospital in Manhattan, the delivery ward on the top floor was still blazing with harsh white lights, where everything operated with the cold precision of modern medical technology. Sterile spaces, state-of-the-art equipment, heartbeats flashing steadily on monitors like a promise that this birth would be perfect. Clara Harrington was born after a meticulously planned delivery. Her first cry rang out clear and strong, prompting the nurses to exchange satisfied nods. All vital signs on the screens fell within the ideal range. Stable heart rate, good lung function, healthy pink skin like any other fortunate child born under the best conditions money could buy. The pediatrician began the routine newborn checks, a series of procedures repeated thousands of times in their careers. The soft clink of instruments echoed steadily in the quiet room. When a gentle clap sounded near her ear, Clara startled with an immediate reflex. A small cry rose and then subsided. Perfect auditory response. Next came touch. Her tiny hand gripped the doctor's finger tightly. When skin met skin, the grasp weak but distinct. Good reflexes. Everything proceeded exactly by the book. Then came the light test, a step that seemed almost procedural. The doctor held a small flashlight and shone it gently through the infant's thin eyelids. Normally, in that moment, the pupils would constrict ever so slightly. The eyelids would reflexively close as a primal instinct. But this time, nothing happened. The light swept across the tender eyes without any response. The doctor paused, changed the angle, moved closer, used brighter light, but the pupils remained motionless. The eyelids stayed open in blank emptiness. No constriction, no avoidance. No one spoke, but the room seemed to slow by a beat. The machines continued their steady hum. But the atmosphere had shifted. A young nurse glanced briefly at the chief physician, then quickly looked down, as if that very glance had brushed against something that shouldn't be named. Elliot Harrington stood beside the delivery bed. His perfectly tailored suit slightly creased at the elbows from standing too long in one position. His eyes were fixed on his daughter. The man accustomed to growth charts, million-line data tables, and billion-dollar decisions now stood frozen before a moment no screen could explain. No algorithm could predict. No number could offer him to cling to. He saw his child cry, heard that cry clearly, saw the small hand grip the doctor's finger tightly. But when the light shone into those eyes, everything seemed to fall into a nameless void, a gap that neither science nor money had yet filled. No one said the word blind. No one made a diagnosis then. But the silence that lingered a few seconds longer was enough to plant a question no one wanted to hear in what was supposed to be the happiest moment of a person's life. Clara Harrington was born healthy, But for her, the world had never appeared. The hours after the birth passed in a state of half-waiting, half-denial. And then the news no one wanted arrived on a quiet morning at a pediatric clinic in New York, where sunlight streamed through large glass windows, but left no trace in Clara Harrington's eyes. The ophthalmologist placed the baby on the exam table and repeated the visual reflex tests more carefully, this time with more specialized equipment. Lights of varying intensity, black and white contrast cards, slow movements in front of the still reddish infant's eyes. But the results remained unchanged. No reflex, no avoidance, no sign of light recognition. After thoroughly examining the eye structure, retina, and optic nerve, the doctor sat down facing the family, voice maintained in the familiar neutral professional tone of the field, confirming what the room had sensed all along: blindness from birth. What made those words heavier wasn't the diagnosis itself, but the doctor's explanation that no clear abnormality was visible. The structure of Clara's eyes appeared normal, no tumors, no obvious damage, no signs of nerve compression. And so, in the medical record appeared a cold but vague phrase: congenital blindness, cause unclear. The word unclear hung in the air, like an incomplete answer. Scientifically accurate, but emotionally unacceptable, especially for Elliot Harrington, who was used to a world where every problem had a cause, every risk a probability, and every question led to a specific solution. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice, just repeated the question in the way of someone unaccustomed to vague answers. Why? And if they didn't know why, then how to fix it. But the doctors could only say they needed time, that science sometimes lagged behind reality, that there was no clear treatment option at present. In contrast to Elliot's silent tension, Clara's mother gradually sank into a different kind of silence, not seeking answers, not asking more questions, just automatically stepping back from the medical discussions, carrying a guilt no one assigned, but that she claimed for herself, as if there had been something during the 9 months of pregnancy she had missed. A moment, a decision, a small sign that should have been noticed sooner. No one in the family said the word permanent, but it began to inhabit their Upper East Side home in its own way, seeping into the pauses between conversations, into glances held too long, into the way everyone avoided mentioning the future beyond the next few months. Clara grew up in a space where light was always present, wide windows welcoming Manhattan's morning sun, rooms designed to maximize daylight, expensive lamps turned on at dusk. But for her, it was only changes in skin temperature and the rhythm of activity around her, not images. She learned to recognize the world through other paths, identifying her father by his slightly heavier footsteps when he entered the room after a long day, her mother by the familiar scent of perfume drifting by whenever she leaned down to pick her up, others by shifts in the air, the soft rustle of clothing, the way sounds in the room changed. When very young, Clara would often raise her hand in front of her face, as if searching for something she couldn't name, then gradually learn to place that hand on the face of the person opposite, touching familiar contours to remember, in her own way. There was one question repeated so often it became a habit, asked in a childish voice, but always with frightening seriousness: "Is Daddy standing in front of me?" It wasn't because Clara couldn't hear the voice, but because she needed confirmation in the surest way she knew. And each time Elliot answered immediately, always standing still until the small hand touched his clothing, as if even one step could cause his daughter's world to lose an anchor. The early years passed quietly, not dramatically as outsiders might imagine, but steadily and persistently, with small adjustments to daily life, sessions with specialists, regular medical appointments, all unfolding in a steady but heavy rhythm, where wealth was no longer a clear advantage, but merely a silent backdrop to the unanswered question. It prolonged the tragedy naturally, binding everyone's emotions not to what they had, but to a child growing day by day in a world she couldn't see, and quietly preparing for the long medical journey ahead, where the word unclear still refused to leave their lives. Unwilling to accept his daughter's life being confined to a vague phrase, Elliot Harrington began doing what he had done throughout his career, seeking the best, not the nearest, not the cheapest, but the names at the top of every medical ranking in the United States. The following weeks passed in the frantic rhythm of private jets, taking off from New York and landing in cities Elliot had previously visited only for deals, now with a single purpose, taking Clara to the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota, where the long, quiet hallways carried the feel of a system run with absolute discipline and centuries of reputation. There, Clara underwent a series of specialized exams, from ophthalmology to neurology, imaging to electrophysiological tests, every piece of data carefully collected and analyzed by doctors Elliot had read about in prestigious medical journals. People accustomed to solving the rarest cases. Results were presented in closed meetings, with lights shining on scans sharp to every detail. But the final answer remained no different from the first. No retinal damage, no signs of inflammation or degeneration, no tumors, no clear structural abnormality to explain why light never reached Clara's world. Leaving Minnesota, they continued to Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, where top neurologists took over the case, delving into hypotheses about the optic nerve and visual processing centers in the brain. Clara was placed in modern imaging machines, the steady hum of equipment sounding like a promise that science was still trying. But once again the conclusion came in the cold caution of expertise. No signs of nerve damage, no compression, no observable congenital malformation. Everything appeared normal by medical standards. Elliot sat silently in luxurious waiting rooms, where coffee was served at the perfect temperature and everything ran smoothly. But in his mind, the repeated conclusions began piling up like an unsolvable series of equations. Each time he heard "we don't see anything wrong," it felt like another door closing. The next stop was Cleveland Clinic in Ohio, whose reputation for diagnosing complex cases made Elliot believe that if anyone could see what others missed, it would be here. Expert panels were convened. Multiple doctors gathered around a long table, Clara's records projected on a large screen, every tiny detail dissected, from birth history to early reflexes. But in the end, the final report carried the same familiar tone. No clear cause, no specific intervention recommended at that time. In a rare moment after the meeting, when most doctors had left, a middle-aged man in a white coat paused beside Elliot. His voice lowered almost to a whisper, not an official statement, just a personal thought shared off the record, that sometimes things were too small for current equipment to detect, or simply not on the list of hypotheses the medical system typically considered. Those words weren't recorded, didn't appear in any report, and weren't enough to launch a new treatment direction, because no one in the system was willing to pursue a baseless hypothesis, especially when all indicators were normal. Elliot carried those words like an incomplete puzzle piece, but he also understood that medicine doesn't operate on personal hunches, and what can't be proven can't become action. The trips ended. They returned to New York with a thick file full of signatures from the biggest names, proof that money had been used to the maximum. Every major door had been knocked on, and every answer received was cruelly the same. Science, at least at that time, had reached its limit, leaving the Harrington family in a logically stalemated state, where no one was wrong, no one negligent, but no one could bring Clara closer to the light. It created a void solid enough that later, when the truth emerged from an unexpected direction, it wasn't an unfounded miracle, but a reminder that sometimes what is overlooked isn't beyond human capability, but beyond their habitual way of looking. Returning to New York after those long trips without bringing back any additional answers, the Harrington family's life gradually settled into a new rhythm, less hopeful but more stable, and Clara entered school age within that quiet rhythm. She was enrolled in a prestigious private school in Manhattan, where everything was designed to meet the most specific needs, from wide hallways and soft lighting, to a staff of teachers specially trained to work with visually impaired children, along with a dedicated aide, who stayed with Clara almost all day, reading books to her, guiding her to touch raised models, and helping her learn Braille from a very early age. On paper, Clara had every resource a blind child could dream of, but in reality, isolation still existed in subtle and hard-to-name ways, not through open discrimination, but through invisible gaps that money couldn't fill. In the schoolyard, the other children ran around, pointed, and laughed at things Clara couldn't see, and though no one intentionally left her out, their pace of life was always one beat faster than the world Clara perceived, causing her to often stand slightly off to the side, listening more than participating. The teachers did their best to integrate her into the classroom, but there were still moments they couldn't intervene in, when games relied on visuals, quick exchanged glances, or wordless smiles happened beyond Clara's reach, leaving her with the feeling that she always arrived a little late, always needing someone to explain what had just occurred. At home, the mansion on the Upper East Side was still filled with light, with large windows welcoming morning sun, and reflecting sunsets on white walls, but for Clara, the only changes she sensed were the room's temperature, and how sounds echoed differently as day turned to night. She learned to navigate the space by memory, counting steps from her bedroom to the stairs, from the stairs to the living room, recognizing each corner through the feel under her feet, and the distinct sense of each area, like the polished wood smell in the library, the faint coffee aroma every morning in the kitchen, or the familiar perfume of her mother whenever she entered the room. Elliot often spent evenings sitting beside his daughter, reading children's books to her, and sometimes articles or documents he himself was in the middle of, not because Clara understood all the content, but because he wanted his voice to become a stable part of her world. There were times when Clara tilted her head, listening intently for a long while, when someone mentioned colors, as if they were a foreign but fascinating language, and she didn't ask much, only occasionally interjecting with short, careful questions, like is red hot, or is blue like the sound of wind? Questions that didn't demand precise answers, but sought some connection to understand what she'd never experienced. Adults were often flustered by those questions, trying to explain with awkward analogies, but Clara showed no disappointment. She just nodded lightly, took it in, and continued listening to others talk about things she knew might forever remain beyond her sight. What troubled those around her most wasn't Clara's sadness, but the absence of it. She rarely complained, rarely asked why she wasn't like other children, as if she'd accepted this reality in the most natural way possible from an early age. Instead of complaining, Clara developed a habit of observing the world through her ears and memory, detecting others' emotions from the slightest changes in their voice, guessing her father's mood from how he closed the door each night, knowing if her mother was worried or relieved just from her breathing rhythm when she sat by the bed. There was one small detail that repeated during those years, becoming part of the daily routine. Whenever Elliot entered the room without speaking right away, Clara would turn her head toward the most familiar sound and ask, in an even but always needing firm confirmation tone, "Are you standing in front of me, Dad?" And Elliot, no matter how busy or tired, would always pause, answer immediately, and take an extra step if needed, so her small hand could touch his clothes. That question wasn't a lack of confidence, but Clara's way of anchoring herself in the world, and each time it was answered, that world became a little more solid. Those years passed like that, without drama, without major events, just the slow growing up of a child in darkness, surrounded by devoted care, but with an invisible distance always existing between her and the rest of the world, a distance not created by material lack, but by not being able to see. And it was Clara's calm acceptance of that distance that made the pain deeper, prolonging the tragedy in the quietest way, tying the emotions of those witnessing it, not to the wealth or power around her, but to the image of a child learning to live fully, in a world where light existed only through others' descriptions, quietly preparing for whatever still lay ahead, where her story was far from over. On the other side of the city, a long subway ride away from the tree-lined streets of the Upper East Side, Brownsville and Brooklyn, woke up each morning to very different sounds, the screech of buses braking at corners, the rattle of metal shutters opening at small corner stores, voices calling to each other from the balconies of old apartment buildings, where life was measured not by comfort, but by the ability to endure day by day. Malik Johnson, 10 years old, grew up in that rhythm, in a small two-room apartment on the third floor of a building that had seen decades of use, where the windows didn't close tightly, and winter always crept in with cold drafts. He lived with his grandmother, Ruth Johnson, a black woman who had endured enough loss to learn how to keep her voice calm even when life wasn't going well. She worked hourly cleaning jobs in office buildings in downtown Brooklyn, waking up very early each day and returning after dark. But their small home was always orderly, not because they had plenty, but because Ruth believed order was the one thing people could create for themselves when they couldn't control much else. Malik was used to preparing simple breakfasts on his own, used to folding his blanket as soon as he woke up, used to placing his shoes neatly by the door, not because anyone forced him, but because that's how his grandmother taught him to respect the space he lived in, no matter how small. Brownsville wasn't the kind of place people often used for uplifting stories. It appeared more in news reports through statistics and headlines about poverty. But for Malik, it was where everyone knew each other's names, where a neighbor would knock to ask him to watch her grandchild while she ran out for something, where the auto shop owner on the corner would give him a piece of candy whenever he lingered watching too long, where kids learned to stay out of trouble by sticking to good habits, because no one here had much margin for too many mistakes. Malik didn't talk much, not out of shyness, but because he was used to observing before speaking, a habit formed from afternoons sitting on the building's front steps, watching people pass by, listening to scattered conversations, and learning to understand what was happening just from tone of voice. At the local public school, Malik wasn't the standout student. His grades were solid, not exceptional, nothing to worry about, but teachers noticed a rare focus in him. He listened more carefully than necessary, paid attention to details. His classmates overlooked, like when a classmate suddenly went unusually quiet, or a teacher spoke slower than usual that day. After school, Malik often helped Ruth with small tasks, carrying heavy bags from the bus stop home, wiping tables, sweeping the floor, and sometimes sat with her in the narrow kitchen, listening to her stories without clear beginnings, about when she was young, about people who had left, about lessons she'd learned after years of standing on her own. In those stories, there were no complaints, just simple lessons about keeping promises, about not hurting others just because you're tired, about bending down to help someone without making anyone feel small. Malik absorbed them like he absorbed the weather, without analyzing or arguing, just letting them become part of how he saw the world. In Brownsville, poverty wasn't an abstract concept. It was there in how people weighed every dollar, in meals carefully planned, in repairing old things instead of buying new. But alongside it was a resilient dignity, a silent agreement that no matter the lack, people still maintained a clear line between need and greed. Malik learned that when he saw his grandmother return a wallet she'd found on the building stairs, even though it had enough money to make their lives easier for weeks. He learned it when she said not everything you can take is something you should. He didn't call those actions kindness, nor did he think he was better than anyone. He just knew that if you could help someone without harming anyone else, it was worth doing, and if you couldn't help, at least don't make things worse. Malik's life went on in days like that. No big events, no dreams drawn too far, just the steady continuation of small things. And in that steadiness, a quiet worldview formed, where a person's value lay not in what they owned, but in how they behaved when no one was watching. While Clara grew up surrounded by light she couldn't see, Malik grew up amid lacks he could see clearly. And those two worlds, seemingly never meant to intersect, were quietly moving closer each day, connected not by money or power, but by small habits formed in a poor but orderly, disciplined community, and above all, one with a dignity that didn't need to be displayed to be recognized. Growing up in Brownsville, Malik Johnson never thought he was doing anything special by paying attention to others, because to him, it was just a natural part of living in a space where people had to notice each other to survive. He was used to observing before reacting, a habit formed from mornings walking to school when he could tell who was in a hurry, just from their stride, who was tired from how they dragged their shoes, and who was pretending to be okay, even though their voice had dropped. Malik didn't stare out of curiosity. He looked to understand, and understood to know what he should do next, or do nothing at all. In his building, small changes in behavior often signaled bigger issues behind them. A neighbor suddenly going out less might mean health problems. A kid quieter than usual might mean trouble at home. and Malik learned to note those signs without judging, without pressing questions, just keeping them in mind as information to respect. When his grandmother came home later than usual, Malik didn't ask much. He just quietly left a glass of water on the table, and when he saw her sit down more slowly than normal, he knew she'd had a harder day, without needing an explanation. At school, Malik wasn't the kid who loudly rushed to help everyone. He didn't raise his hand to brag about good deeds or seek teacher praise. But if a classmate dropped their notebook, he'd be the one to pick it up before anyone could laugh. And if another kid sat alone too long during recess, he'd sit nearby, not saying much, just letting his presence ease the feeling of being left out. Malik didn't call those actions kindness, because in his world, kindness was a big concept often tied to dramatic situations, while what he did was just small things, like holding the door for the person behind or giving up a seat on the bus. Things Ruth had said were only valuable if no one noticed. He learned to notice details others missed, like someone speaking normally, but with slightly trembling hands, or smiling but with uneven breathing. And even if he didn't always understand why, Malik knew those signs deserved attention more than ignoring. That way of seeing the world didn't make him gloomy, or too serious for his age. On the contrary, it made him calmer amid the ups and downs around him, because once used to realizing everyone carried something inside, he was less surprised by others' irritability or indifference. Malik didn't try to fix the world, nor think he had to. He just followed a simple principle, his grandmother repeated often, that if you could make someone's day a little less heavy without costing anything, do it, and if not, at least don't make it heavier. On the rare free afternoon, Malik sat on the building steps, watching other kids play, listening to scattered conversations, and letting those observations settle in his mind, without needing to organize or label them, as if they were just part of a bigger picture he didn't need to fully understand yet. It was that familiarity with observing, with noticing the unsaid, that gradually shaped in Malik a very personal worldview. Not based on what was most obviously displayed, but on the smallest changes, the most easily overlooked details. And he carried that view as something obvious, not as a proud quality, but as a habit, so ingrained that without it, he'd feel something was missing. While Malik continued his steady days in Brownsville with silent observations and nameless small acts, on the other side of the city, Manhattan kept running on the rhythm of power and presence, where everything had clear shapes, from towering buildings reflecting sunlight on glass facades, to decisions made in closed meeting rooms with influence far beyond one neighborhood. The Harrington family moved naturally in that world, smooth riding cars through wide avenues, automatic doors opening before anyone touched them, appointments scheduled to the exact minute, and Clara grew up amid that perfect care as the only quiet point in a system that always ran smoothly. In Manhattan, power was in tangible things, access cards, names recognized the moment someone entered a room, the ability to make others pause and listen, while in Brooklyn, especially Brownsville, presence took a different, less visible form, in leaving doors ajar for neighbors, sharing tips about side jobs, in quietly noticing who was struggling without loud questions. Malik didn't know much about Manhattan beyond glimpses on the subway, when going with his grandmother to work. Brighter stations, better-dressed people, huge ads filling the view, and he didn't think much about the differences, because to him the world was measured by what happened right in front of him, not far away. Clara, by contrast, lived in the city's center, but accessed it through descriptions, careful accounts from others about crowded streets, the colors of park leaves, lights reflecting on the river at night, images built in her imagination from scattered pieces, never complete, but enough for her to know a vast world existed around her. Those two worlds ran parallel, separated by just a few dozen subway minutes, but divided by invisible boundaries. No map showed clearly, boundaries between being seen and not being seen, between having a voice and only silent presence. In Manhattan, when Elliot Harrington entered a room, people knew who he was, what he represented, and his words carried the weight of power. In Brooklyn, Malik walked narrow hallways without anyone calling his name or waiting for his decisions. but his absence somewhere was sometimes noticed faster than the arrival of powerful people elsewhere. Power on one side was the ability to change systems. On the other, invisibility was the ability to move through systems without noise or trace, but also to easily see overlooked details. Clara couldn't see Manhattan with her eyes, but she sensed it through changes in her father's voice, after long days, through the caution around her when talking about the future, through silences longer than necessary. Malik saw Brooklyn clearly, but didn't name its hardships, because to him they were just the familiar backdrop of life, not something to emphasize or pity. The two children grew up with different limits. Clara limited by not seeing, Malik limited by not being seen, and both learned to adapt without being taught. That parallelism didn't create direct conflict, but was like two lines running in the same direction, without intersecting, one illuminated by attention and power, the other in the shadow of anonymity, and because it wasn't blinded by glaring light. The second line retained the ability to notice the smallest things, the slightest shifts in others' rhythms. The encounter took place on a weekend afternoon in Central Park, in a moment that held nothing particularly memorable if not looked back upon later. When the Harrington family decided to take Clara out for a change of scenery, a habit maintained regularly as a way to keep the little girl connected to a world larger than the familiar rooms. The park was moderately crowded at that time, the sounds of children laughing blending with the noises of joggers and the wind rustling through the tree canopy, and Clara sat on a long bench near the walking path, her hands resting lightly on the armrest, listening to the world moving around her in her own way. Elliot stood not far away, talking with an acquaintance, while the mother sat beside her daughter, explaining to the girl what was happening, about the green of the grass, about the leaves fluttering in the wind, descriptions that had become familiar but were still delivered with the necessary care. Malik was in Central Park that day with his grandmother, a rare outing after many weeks spent mostly in Brooklyn, and he wandered a bit farther from her to take in the unfamiliar sights, the wider open spaces, the cleaner paths, the people he didn't know by name. As he passed the bench where Clara was sitting, Malik slowed down, not out of curiosity, but because he noticed a very subtle difference in the way the girl was listening to her surroundings, her head tilted slightly forward, her body holding a faint tension, as if trying to catch sounds that didn't entirely belong to her. No one had told Malik that Clara couldn't see, but he sensed it from the way she didn't turn her head toward movements, from the way her hand lightly clenched whenever someone passed too close. Malik didn't stand staring down at her, didn't ask the usual questions that adults often ask in such situations, didn't say, "What's wrong with you?" or "Do you need help?" because he knew those questions often put the other person in the position of having to explain something they were already used to carrying. Instead, Malik stepped closer and did something very simple. He sat down on the grass right in front of Clara, at her eye level, so that his presence wouldn't become a sudden large shadow, then spoke softly, not too loud, not too quiet, asking a question that might have seemed odd in the context. "Are you hurting anywhere?" That question didn't assume, didn't label, didn't demand a specific answer. It simply opened a possibility, and because of that, Clara wasn't flustered. She turned her head toward the new voice, listening carefully before replying that no, she wasn't hurting, just a bit uncomfortable when the wind blew into her eyes. Malik nodded, as if that answer was enough, and said nothing more for the next few seconds, just sitting there quietly, letting the natural silence unfold without needing to fill it. Clara's mother had noticed them from the start, initially a bit wary as any adult would be, when seeing a strange child approach their own, but the calmness in Malik's demeanor kept her from interrupting, and Elliot, from afar, only glanced over before continuing his conversation, as nothing in the scene suggested anything unusual or dangerous. Clara, after a few minutes, began asking Malik small questions in return, asking where he was sitting, whether the grass was wet, why he had asked if she was hurting, and Malik answered each one briefly, without embellishment, without trying to seem more knowledgeable than necessary. The conversation unfolded slowly, without any climax, but there was a very subtle shift in the air around them, as if two parallel worlds had touched at a small point of contact, enough for both to recognize the other's presence. Malik didn't know that the moment he chose to sit down instead of standing and staring had made him the only one there to approach Clara in a way that was neither imposing, nor curious, nor pitying. And Clara didn't know that that simple question had opened a door that no one had thought of for many years. After the moment of sitting face to face in the rare quiet of Central Park, Malik didn't leave right away as he usually did after chance encounters. Not because he felt any special responsibility, but because there was a very faint, very familiar feeling, like when he noticed something in a room was out of rhythm with the rest. Clara continued sitting on the bench, listening to the wind and the people around her, while Malik, still at her level, noticed how she reacted to the smallest changes in the environment, not with her eyes, but with her body. When a stronger gust of wind blew through, Malik saw Clara slightly frown, her hand on the armrest tightening, her head tilting very lightly, as if avoiding a familiar discomfort. Malik didn't say anything then, just noted it, the way he was used to noting hundreds of other small signs in everyday life. The mother continued describing the scene in front of Clara, talking about the colors of the leaves, about the sunlight filtering through the branches, and during that time, Malik noticed that whenever the wind brushed her face, Clara tended to raise her hand near her eyes in an almost unconscious reflex, then stop midway, as if accustomed to not touching there. He knew nothing about medicine, no terms or anatomical structures, but he knew what a normal reflex was, and what a reflex carrying the avoidance of pain looked like. Malik slowly shifted his sitting position, just moving a bit to the side to observe from a different angle, and from that angle, he noticed something that wouldn't be easy to see standing upright. The skin very close to Clara's eyelid right at the inner corner seemed to always tense up with even the smallest stimulus, whether wind, faint light through the trees, or just a natural blink. Malik didn't touch her, didn't point, didn't speak loudly, he just asked one more very soft question, keeping the same initial calm tone, whether when the wind blew into her eyes, the feeling was like something gritty or stinging. Clara thought for a moment before answering, as if trying to find the right words for a sensation that had existed too long to still be noticed, then said that sometimes it felt like there was something very small there, not exactly painful, but always making her want to close her eyes, even though she couldn't see anything anyway. That answer made Malik go quiet for a moment, because in his mind, two things that seemed unrelated suddenly touched the blindness diagnosis since birth, and this very specific, very localized discomfort around the eyelid, not widespread, not vague. He didn't conclude, didn't speculate further, just continued observing, noticing that when Clara lightly touched her cheek near her eye, she did it very slowly, as if afraid of brushing a certain spot, and when Malik asked if she had ever mentioned this to a doctor, Clara answered honestly that yes, but it wasn't important, because she was used to it, and doctors usually asked if she could see anything, not if she was in pain. Malik didn't know that that statement, uttered so casually, had inadvertently touched the very gap in the medical system's perspective that the Harrington family had faced for years, where questions always revolved around visual function, images, optical reflexes, and rarely paused on the specific pain or discomfort of a child who had never seen. Malik didn't think he was discovering anything major. He just knew there was a detail there, small enough to be overlooked, if you didn't sit low enough, observe long enough, and ask the right question. He remembered the times his grandmother complained of knee pain but didn't see a doctor because she thought it was just age, until a neighbor noticed how her way of stepping downstairs had changed, and that small detail led to discovering the real issue. Malik understood that sometimes people live with a sensation so long they consider it normal, and those around them, even doctors, grow accustomed to overlooking it, if it isn't on the list of symptoms to look for. When Elliot and Clara's mother approached, Malik didn't say anything right away, didn't rush to share his thoughts, because he wasn't used to inserting himself into adult stories, especially ones carrying so much hope and disappointment. But when the mother gently asked what the two were talking about, Malik simply replied with a very straightforward sentence, neither assertive nor alarming, that Clara said her eyes sometimes felt gritty and stinging with wind, and he didn't know if it was related, but it seemed to always happen in the same spot. That statement didn't startle anyone, didn't cause an immediate shift in attitude, but it landed in the space between them like a small pebble dropped into still water, creating very faint ripples. Elliot listened, without rebutting, without dismissing, just looking at his daughter with a different expression, for the first time not seeking answers in data or reports, but in the child's own body. Malik didn't know that dozens of the best doctors in America had examined those eyes under much brighter lights, with far more advanced equipment, but none of them had ever sat at Clara's level long enough to notice that very subtle avoidance. None had ever asked about the tiny pain she had learned to endure from when she was too young to name it. Nothing happened immediately after Malik's words. No calling a doctor, no commotion, or hasty decisions, because everyone was too accustomed to hoping, and then returning to the starting point. But there was a very subtle change in the way Clara's mother looked at her daughters, as if for the first time she wasn't just seeing the diagnosis, but a specific sensation, a very small detail previously set aside, because it didn't fit the overall picture. They didn't leave the park right away. Clara stayed seated, Malik remained nearby, and when the next gust of wind came, the familiar avoidance reflex appeared again, clearer now that people had started paying attention to it. Clara's hand slightly drawing back, her eyelid faintly trembling in a way that wasn't entirely natural. The mother asked her daughter in the gentlest voice possible whether that feeling was always in the same place, and Clara nodded, saying it was always near the inner corner of her left eye, very close to the lid, and that she was used to closing her eyes whenever it felt like something was touching from inside. Malik didn't interrupt, he just observed, but when the mother leaned in closer to examine that area carefully, Malik instinctively moved nearer too, not to touch, but to see from the angle he had seen before. And at that moment, in the soft afternoon light, something almost imperceptible began to reveal itself, a very tiny point, nearly transparent, hidden right along the lash line, not obvious like a foreign object, but resembling part of the skin. If not looked at long enough, if not knowing what to look for, it would easily be missed as it had been hundreds of times before. Malik swallowed hard, not out of fear, but because he understood that there are moments when saying the wrong thing, or making the wrong move could make everything worse, and he didn't want to be the one to cause that. He asked the mother a very simple question, whether Clara would allow him to lightly touch the area near her eye. Not to do anything, just to see if the feeling was like when he had touched a tiny speck of dust caught on his grandmother's eyelash before. The mother looked at Elliot. Elliot looked at his daughter, and Clara, after a brief silence, nodded, not because she understood what was about to happen, but because she was used to trusting calm voices. Malik washed his hands with the small bottle of water he carried, dried them on his clean t-shirt, then leaned in very slowly, every movement carefully calculated, not like a curious child, but like someone trying not to hurt anyone. He didn't touch the eye directly, just placed his fingertip on the skin right next to the lid, where Clara said the gritty feeling was, and almost immediately, Clara flinched slightly, not strongly, but enough to confirm that was the most sensitive spot. Malik stopped, apologized right away, then tried again even more gently, and this time, he felt something very strange under his fingertip, not soft skin like the rest, but a very tiny hard point, barely raised, but clearly not belonging to the body in a normal way. He didn't dare trust his own sensation, but when he shifted his fingertip by a very small angle, the feeling remained there, fixed, not moving with the skin, as if something was lying just beneath. Malik looked up at the mother, not saying he was certain, just that it seemed like there was something very small there, and if it was just a speck of dust or a foreign body, sometimes it could just be pulled out, but he didn't know if that was safe. Elliot stood still, all his controlling reflexes pushed aside, not because he believed in miracles, but because he realized that for years, no one had ever considered the issue from this angle. No one had ever treated that tiny discomfort as a clue. The mother decided to call a nurse she knew in the area, who happened to be in the park with her own child, and with maximum caution, they created the quietest space possible, not to do anything dangerous, but to look more closely under better light. When the nurse shone a small flashlight near the eyelid, what Malik had felt by touch began to become clearer. A very thin strand, almost transparent, embedded diagonally into the skin right along the lid, not large enough to show clearly on imaging devices, but enough to cause constant irritation with wind, light, or small movements. With simple tools and absolute focus, the nurse used tweezers to grasp very gently, little by little, and in that moment, Clara winced, then suddenly relaxed, as if a familiar pressure had just vanished. The object was pulled from the skin, so small that if placed on a fingertip, it was nearly weightless, a thin, hard fiber, origin unknown, something that had been there for years without anyone noticing. No one said anything for the next few seconds, not because they were waiting for something big, but because they didn't know if this meant anything beyond removing a source of discomfort. Clara took a deep breath, then suddenly frowned in a different way, not from pain, but from an unfamiliar sensation. She raised her hand in front of her face, slowly, as if trying to touch the air, and said in a slightly trembling voice, asking why everything suddenly felt brighter, even though she still couldn't see anything clearly. That statement froze everyone, because it was the first time Clara had used the word brighter to describe her own sensation, not from others' descriptions, but from her own experience. Malik stepped back, not out of fear, but because he felt he shouldn't stand too close to this moment, as if what had just happened didn't belong to him, but to Clara and the world she was beginning to touch. The light in the park remained the same, unchanged, but for Clara, something had shifted very slightly, enough to create a new boundary between before and after, between familiar darkness and a sensation that had no name yet. After the afternoon in Central Park, no one in the Harrington family slept soundly that night, not out of excitement, but because of the familiar fear that every ray of hope could vanish, the moment they stepped into the cold light of the hospital where emotions had to give way to evidence. The next morning, Clara was taken straight to New York, Presbyterian Hospital, this time not for a routine checkup, but for a series of urgent tests carried out by the doctors who had followed her case for years, and new specialists summoned in just a few hours. The small object removed in the park, placed in a sterile container, was sent to the lab, where technicians used microscopes to magnify what had seemed almost invisible dozens of times, enough to recognize that it was not dust, not an eyelash, but a hard, extremely thin fragment of material with a structure that did not belong in the human body. At the same time, Clara underwent vision tests unlike any in her records before, not just questions about whether she could see or not, but more subtle experiments, measuring pupil responses to dim light, recording neural signals when light reached the retina, signals that previously either hadn't appeared or had been drowned out by constant irritation from the object lodged near her eyelid. The doctors began piecing together what had seemed like disconnected fragments, the persistent sensation of something in her eye over the years, unexplained avoidance reflexes, normal imaging results that were never quite complete, and now, with the abnormal irritant removed, a new picture was emerging with a clarity no one had achieved before. In a meeting that lasted hours, ophthalmologists and neurologists sat together, analyzing the latest data, and for the first time, instead of ending with cautious statements, the discussion reached a clearer conclusion: that tiny fragment of material, lodged near the eyelid, and causing constant irritation to the visual reflex zone, had triggered a prolonged chain of inhibition, preventing Clara's visual system from ever developing normally. One doctor explained that in the early years of life, when the brain is still learning to process signals from the eyes, even very mild constant pain is enough to teach the brain to avoid light as a protective reflex, and over time, that reflex becomes the default, completely masking whatever weak visual signals remain. This explained why previous scans had found no clear damage. Structurally, Clara's eyes and optic nerves were intact. They had simply been held in a state of prolonged inhibition by a mechanical factor too small to be considered significant in standard diagnostic protocols. Once the fragment was removed, the source of irritation disappeared, and the visual system, though suppressed for 10 years, began tentatively sending its first signals again, like a door that had been locked for too long finally creaking open. Elliot sat in that meeting room, listening to every explanation, every medical term. But this time he didn't cling to numbers or charts. He clung to a phrase repeated by several people in the room. That the object was the central cause, not a secondary factor, not a random detail, but the missing piece that had caused the entire story to be misunderstood for a decade. None of the doctors shied away from responsibility. They openly admitted that during the diagnostic process, the system had focused too much on what was clearly visible on screens, on major abnormalities, while overlooking the possibility of a tiny factor outside the usual hypotheses, especially when the patient was a child unable to describe her sensations in medical language. An older doctor who had been part of one of the earlier diagnostic panels spoke slowly, saying that modern medicine is very good at finding familiar things, but sometimes less sensitive to what doesn't fit the pattern. And Clara's case was a heartbreaking example of that. When the official conclusion was entered into her records, for the first time in 10 years the phrase "cause unclear" disappeared, replaced by a specific diagnosis confirming that the abnormal fragment had caused prolonged visual inhibition, leading to functional blindness throughout her early years. No one promised that Clara would immediately see like a normal child. The doctors emphasized that recovery, if it happened, would require time, therapy, and patience, as the brain needed to relearn how to process light. But the most important thing had been established. The darkness Clara had lived in for 10 years was not an unchangeable fate, but the result of a very specific, very small cause that had been overlooked. Clara didn't understand everything the adults were saying, but she sensed the difference in the atmosphere, in the way people spoke to each other, in the faint relief in her mother's hand holding hers, and in the fact that the light in the room no longer bothered her as much, even though she still couldn't make out shapes or colors clearly. Malik was not in that meeting room. He had returned to Brownsville after the afternoon in the park as if nothing special had happened, but his name came up in later conversations with quiet respect, not as a hero but as an indispensable part of the chain of events that led to the truth. As that day ended, the Harrington family walked out of the hospital with a feeling they had never experienced before. Not triumph, not a complete miracle, but clarity, something that seemed simple yet had been absent for so long. And in that clarity, for the first time in 10 years, Clara's future was no longer defined by a vague void, but by a difficult yet real path, opened by the fact that a tiny object had finally been seen and properly named. The medical clarity brought the Harrington family a relief they had never known, but it also opened an unavoidable question, one no one in that meeting room voiced right away, though everyone thought it. If that fragment had been there for 10 years, where had it come from? The investigation began quietly, no police showing up at the hospital entrance, no public accusations, just a series of silent record requests, discreet calls between departments, and a small team of doctors and medical lawyers, authorized by Elliot to trace back every detail of Clara's birth. The first documents reviewed were the records from New York, Presbyterian Hospital, where Clara was born, delivery room notes, the list of staff on duty that day, even seemingly harmless notes about post-delivery procedures, all re-examined with unprecedented care. At first everything looked perfectly normal. An uncomplicated birth, stable vitals, no incidents recorded. But that very perfection drew the team's attention to small gaps, overly brief notes, details crossed out without further explanation, as if certain things had been dismissed as insignificant from the start. When the records moved to the newborn care phase in those first days, nurses' reports were cross-checked line by line, hour by hour, and there a very small anomaly began to emerge. Not enough to raise suspicion at the time, but enough to stand out in retrospect, a note that Clara often squeezed her eyes shut more tightly than usual when her face was cleaned, quickly explained as a newborn's sensitive reaction to light. The note wasn't wrong, but it became a crucial piece when placed alongside Clara's later descriptions of the gritty, stinging sensation around her eyelid, tracking everyone who had direct contact with Clara in her first weeks, from nurses to support staff, and then to a name that seemed unrelated but appeared regularly in the care schedule. The first nanny the Harringtons hired right after Clara came home. The woman had worked for the family for nearly the first 6 months, a long enough time to become a familiar part of daily life, yet short enough to leave little trace when she left. Interviews were conducted privately. Not as interrogations, just questions about care routines and early challenges with a baby who reacted unusually to light. Most answers aligned, until a very small detail emerged in one former nurse's recollection. She remembered the nanny complaining that Clara cried whenever her face was wiped, and that once she had asked permission to use a very thin protective bandage around the eye area to reduce stimulation. That information was never entered into the official records, because at the time it was seen as a harmless temporary measure. But when cross-referenced with the object removed from Clara's eyelid, the team began to see a more disturbing possibility. Forensic medical experts were brought in. They analyzed the material under a microscope and determined it did not come from any medical instrument used in the delivery room, nor was it a natural fiber from clothing or bedding, but a synthetic fragment commonly found in cheap protective bandages or medical tape, rigid enough to hold its shape yet thin enough not to cause acute injury. When the former nanny was contacted again, this time with more specific questions, her story began to show small inconsistencies, not outright lies, but evasions, long pauses before answering, and finally, faced with the material evidence, and pieced together notes, the truth emerged in a way no one wanted. The woman admitted that in those early months caring for Clara, she had felt overwhelmed and frustrated by the baby's strong reactions to light or close contact around the face, and in a moment of lost patience, she had on her own cut a very small piece of protective bandage and placed it near the eyelid, intending to limit the reflex, believing it was a harmless temporary fix. She hadn't thought the fragment could slip deeper into the eyelid area and get stuck there, nor that failing to report it would lead to consequences lasting years. There was no elaborate plot, no grand motive beyond carelessness and ignorance, but that made the truth even heavier. Clara's tragedy did not stem from an unavoidable accident, but from a small, wrong decision made in silence, and overlooked by a system not accustomed to questioning things deemed too minor. Elliot heard the full report in a closed room, not exploding in anger, not demanding immediate retribution, but sitting silent at the thought that for 10 years his family had searched the world for a rare cause, while the real cause had been there from the very first days, hidden not by sophisticated deception, but by irresponsibility allowed to exist in the shadow of seemingly harmless procedures. The investigation ended not with a loud announcement, but with the truth fully documented, the involved parties handled according to regulations, and most importantly, a chain of errors identified so they would not be repeated with other children. After the investigation closed in the necessary silence, reports signed, procedures completed, the truth placed in its proper spot in both medical and legal records, Elliot Harrington realized there was still one thing he hadn't done, something outside any protocol yet heavier than all the meetings he had ever attended. He went to Brownsville unannounced. No flashy escort. Just a single car pulling up in front of the old building where Malik lived with his grandmother on an ordinary afternoon like any other. Late sunlight slanting through the iron balconies and familiar neighborhood sounds drifting from the surrounding apartments. Elliot entered that space with an uncharacteristic slowness, not out of fear, but because he understood that here, hurried steps felt out of place. Malik was sitting on the steps doing homework when the tall man stopped in front of him, not hiding who he was but not using it as a shield either, simply saying the boy's name clearly, not loudly, not commanding. Malik looked up, recognized the man who had stood beside Clara in the park that day, and stood up out of reflex, not from fear or awe, but from the politeness his grandmother had taught him since he was little. Elliot didn't speak right away, didn't start with a prepared thank you, didn't recount what had happened to emphasize the moment's importance. He just looked at Malik for a few seconds, long enough for the boy to see that the gaze held no judgment or curiosity, only complete undivided attention. Then Elliot did something very few people had ever seen him do. He bent down, not a polite nod, but lowering himself to be eye level with the 10-year-old in front of him, so the distance between them was no longer measured by status or age but by the simple presence of two people. He didn't give a speech, didn't recount his family's long struggle, didn't say Malik had changed their lives, because he knew those words, however sincere, could place an unnecessary burden on the boy's shoulders. Instead, Elliot said very little, just one short sentence, slowly, without embellishment, that he had searched everywhere for an answer for his daughter. But in the end, the person who saw what mattered most was a boy the system had never bothered to notice. Malik listened, head not bowed, not flustered, just nodding slightly, as if the man were stating something obvious that didn't need repeating. Elliot didn't defend medicine's mistakes, didn't say no one meant harm, didn't apologize on behalf of an entire system, because he knew some apologies, if spoken, would only lighten the speaker's responsibility. What he needed to do was acknowledge a simple but hard truth, that his power, money, and knowledge had not been enough to see what Malik saw, not because Malik was smarter, but because Malik had been in the right position to observe. The conversation was brief. No lingering, no promises about Malik's future, no offers to change his life with a single signature, because Elliot understood that turning Malik into a success story by his own standards would be another form of imposition. Instead, he said that if Malik and his grandmother ever needed anything related to health or education in their community, he would stand behind those efforts, not as a favor, but as part of his responsibility, and if Malik didn't want that, he would respect it. Malik listened, then answered calmly that he had only done what anyone should do if they saw something wrong, and that Clara didn't deserve to live in darkness just because a detail was missed. The words carried no accusation, sought no recognition, but they silenced Elliot for a few seconds, because for the first time in years he realized some truths don't need complex language. They just need to be said at the right moment by the right person. Before leaving, Elliot stood up slowly, didn't shake Malik's hand as a formality, but placed his hand on his own chest, in a small gesture of acknowledgement that didn't make the boy the center of unwanted attention, then turned to greet Grandma Ruth with clear respect in every movement. As the car left Brownsville, Elliot didn't carry the relief of someone who had fulfilled a duty. He carried a deeper change, an understanding that bending down didn't make him smaller, but allowed him to see what he had missed for a decade. And that silence, when placed correctly, can sometimes be the most powerful form of acknowledgement. After that brief encounter, life in Brownsville didn't change in the way people often tell stories. No luxury cars came back to pick Malik up every morning. No surprise scholarship was announced in the newspapers. No big doors swung open just because he'd stood in the right place at the right time. Malik still woke up in the small third-floor apartment, still heard Grandma Ruth getting up early to get ready for work, still folded his own blanket, slipped on his old but cleanly wiped shoes, and walked to the public school in the neighborhood like any other day. No one in his class knew that the boy sitting in the row by the window had helped change the life of another child in Manhattan, and Malik had no urge to tell the story either, because to him, everything that had happened was simply a natural continuation of what he'd always done. Grandma Ruth had heard Elliot Harrington talk about supporting the community, about health and education projects that could be launched in Brooklyn, but she didn't let those words change how she saw the world. She just nodded, said thank you, and went on with her work in the same careful way as before, because she knew that dignity doesn't come from being noticed, but from not losing yourself when the chance to be lifted up arrives. Malik kept helping his grandmother carry heavy grocery bags from the bus stop home, kept sitting in the narrow kitchen listening to her tell old stories, and kept observing the world around him in his familiar way, without looking for signs that he had changed, without comparing his life to Clara's, because he understood that everyone has their own place to stand, and not every place needs to be changed to have value. At school, Malik was still not the standout student. His grades stayed steady, good enough not to cause worry, ordinary enough not to draw attention, and the teachers still saw him as a hard-working, polite kid who was a good listener, no more, no less. He wasn't called up on stage to receive an award for kindness, nor was he held up as an example at parent-teacher meetings, and it was precisely the absence of those moments of recognition that kept his life from veering off its familiar path. Malik still sat on the front steps of the building on idle afternoons, watching the other kids run and play, listening to the scattered conversations drifting from the surrounding apartments, and sometimes thought about Clara, not with pride or regret, but with a gentle curiosity about how she was learning to see the world, whether the light still bothered her, and whether she was asking new questions about things that had previously only existed through stories told to her. Those thoughts came and went without taking over Malik's mind, because he still had plenty right in front of him to pay attention to, from the new neighbor, who seemed out of place, to his grandmother coughing a little more on cold days. Small details that, if ignored, would make the world a little heavier for someone. Malik wasn't saved in any sense of the word. No one came to tell him his life would be different from now on. And he didn't expect it either, because he had never seen his life as something that needed rescuing. It just needed to be lived on kindly, with the small choices made each day. It was that very ordinary continuation, that steadfastness in staying in his own place without chasing sudden spotlights, that clarified what Elliot Harrington was beginning to understand, that Malik's value didn't lie in having done something extraordinary, but in not letting that extraordinary thing pull him away from who he had always been. Time passed quietly after major events. And that's how real change takes root. Clara Harrington entered a new phase of her life, not marked by newspaper headlines or victory announcements, but by regular vision therapy sessions, quiet rooms where light was carefully adjusted, and very small moments that were enough to leave the whole family speechless, like when she first distinguished between light and dark, without anyone explaining it, or when she paused for a long time by the window, saying nothing, just letting her body get used to a sensation that had been denied her for 10 years. The doctors made no promises beyond reality. They spoke of adaptation, of the brain needing time to relearn what had been suppressed for too long. And Clara progressed in slow steps without rushing, without disappointment, as if she were already more patient than her age. Elliot stood beside his daughter in those moments, no longer the man obsessed with controlling everything, but a father learning to stand still and watch, learning to let small things happen without pushing. And in Clara's change he recognized another, quieter change in himself, an adjustment in how he viewed the world and the people who had existed on its margins for far too long. He kept his word to Malik, not turning the boy's story into a symbol to polish his own image, not putting the child on stage for inspirational speeches, but choosing a less noticed path, quietly supporting community eye care programs in Brooklyn, funding free screening clinics, basic health training courses for under-resourced areas, things that didn't carry his name on big billboards, but were enough to create real change for people who weren't used to being seen. Malik occasionally heard his grandmother mention that the local clinic had new equipment, that more doctors were coming in for shifts, and he didn't connect it to himself, not because he didn't understand, but because he didn't need to. Those changes existed independently of whether he was part of the story or not. Clara and Malik didn't meet again often. There were no arranged reunions to revisit a moment that had passed, but occasionally through short letters read slowly, Clara told Malik about the things she was learning to see, how morning light was different from afternoon light, how colors weren't like any sounds she had ever imagined, and Malik read those lines with his usual attention, replying briefly, asking very specific questions like whether the light still hurt her, or whether her eyes got tired from looking too long. Questions not meant to create big emotions, but to make sure the most important things were still being noticed. Life kept moving to its own rhythms. Manhattan remained bright and busy, Brooklyn remained crowded and resilient, and between the two invisible threads were reconnected, not by power or fame, but by timely attention to small details. Clara's story didn't end with a perfect conclusion, because nothing is perfect in a journey that began with 10 years of darkness, but it ended with something more lasting, a truth that had been seen and named, and a path that had been opened, slowly, difficultly, but truly. Malik's story didn't need a climax to be complete either, because he was still there, in his community, continuing to watch, continuing to care in the simplest way, without needing anyone to confirm that what he did mattered, because the quiet existence of those habits already created the meaning. When all the stage lights had gone out, when the medical explanations had been filed away, what remained wasn't a miracle, but a quiet reminder that this world doesn't lack light. It only lacks people willing to bend down low enough to see what's being overlooked. If you want to keep following real stories that make us rethink beliefs, power, and human kindness, please subscribe to the channel now, so you don't miss any episode. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next story.